This is StoryLink Radio. The professional storytellers at StoryLink Radio have been around for a long time. The Irish knew storytellers by the name Shawnee. We are committed to bringing stories to life through the spoken word, as in traditional oral storytelling. We present stories of many genres: ancient myths and legends, short stories, full-length novels, science fiction, high fantasy, philosophy, traditions, classics, drama, fiction, non-fiction, romance, theater, ghosts and haunts, stories of the strange, and much, much more. Our stories may be drawn from contemporary sources or from some dusty, near-forgotten tome. Regardless, it is a treat like no other to listen to stories and tales presented in a live format with the emotion and feeling a true professional storyteller brings, conjuring up images of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. So join us at StoryLink Radio and let us be your Shawnee for a time. Our stories are presented before a live audience, then recorded for the StoryLink Radio podcast for your on-demand listening pleasure. Please visit StoryLinkRadio.com for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Visit www.storylinkradio.com. Every story, every person, every thought can be read, seen, interpreted, either positively or negatively, like the well-known glass that is half full or half empty. Almost always, it depends only on us. Certainly the context created by our environment and the others who are near us, by calm weather or the storms raging about us, by a life that is more or less easy. All these things can influence us. But how can we call ourselves human if we justify ourselves as if we were mere shadows at the mercy of destiny? The people, facts, places, and names in this story have as their starting point some of the rites linked to the Celtic festivities of Samhain. They are based on the well-known legends of Jack-o'-lantern and the customs, probably also of Celtic origins, of displaying carved pumpkins with lights inside them on the night of October 31st. Originally, Jack's lantern was formed by carving a large yellow turnip. Only later, when, thanks to the large number of Irish immigrants, the celebration spread to the United States, where the traditional turnips used in Ireland, and indeed a large part of the Anglo-Saxon world, also known as Swedes, Swedish turnips, rutabaga, or yellow turnips, that is, brassica napus, replaced by the more practical pumpkins that better lend themselves to being hollowed out and carved, as well as being much bigger to hold candles and lights inside them. However, similar traditions in which pumpkins were used existed in many other parts of Europe even before the new trend came back from America. Jack-o'-lantern, in modern English, apart from signifying the protagonist's name, also became the name given to the Halloween pumpkins. Their soft center is scraped out and they are suitably carved, usually to look like the outline of a face, and then a source of light is placed inside, usually a small lamp or a candle. This has the double objective of being a reminder of Jack's famous lantern and of illuminating the features of the carved shape. On the other hand, according to some traditions, these shapes represent souls who are marooned in purgatory, while in others they are just shapes whose purpose is to frighten away the spirits of the dead from returning to the world of the living, including Jack himself. The tradition of putting on masks representing other spirits, ghosts or witches, would have arisen for the same reason, namely, to scare off these spirits from returning to the world of the living. The Irish versions of the legend of Jack-o'-lantern also deal with the story and the events that happened to an ordinary man named Jack, or Will, who was to give rise to some of these traditions. A drunken gambler, miserly and cunning, who couldn't get anything right, but who twice managed to get the better of the devil. This story that follows is a free interpretation of these legends that have come down to us in different versions, and also forms in part a contrast to them, giving a modern, introspective, and in some ways motivational account by adding characteristics, contexts, episodes, and implications that are entirely the fruit of the author's imagination. October 2014, Wharton Arville. This book is dedicated to Jack. If not him, who else? Well, if by chance there were someone else. To the great carver of pumpkins, to have mine carved as well, and have placed inside it the faint flame of my soul, so it will shine among the others in the vast night of the universe, and light up my path during the dark days of my life. According to an ancient Celtic legend, it is said that on the night of Samhain, a night that is outside the cycle of time because it belongs neither to the old year that has just ended, nor to the new year that has not yet begun. It may be possible to discern, in the mists that separate the world of the living from that of the spirits, a man who wanders in search of the road to paradise. He holds his lantern in a hollowed-out pumpkin, and inside it there would be a burning firebrand from the embers of hell. That man is Jack. Jack O'Lantern. But who was Jack? The only ordinary man who has a feast day dedicated to him that by now is celebrated the world over. Why do we celebrate him on Halloween night? Hardly anyone knows his story. To hell with them, Jack would say. Chapter 1. Jack. All our dignity consists in thought. This is the basis on which we must raise ourselves, and not space and time, which we would not know how to fill. Let us make it our task, then, to think well. Here is the principle of morality. Blaise Pascal. Autumn had already started to adorn the plains and the sea, the slopes of the mountains and the banks of the rivers with mists and silence. Jack. Another year was drawing to its close. For those who still remembered the records of the ancient calendar of those lands, when months still carried the names of trees or moons, and new days began immediately after sunset, Jack was a bad lot. But even with a different calendar, people got ready for the festivities in the same way. Because even if the men who prayed in catacombs and churches had imposed a new calendar on the people who used to worship under the trees or looking up to the sky, the tradition of feasting in that period when summer has gone and autumn has been there for a while has remained. And in the end, everyone went on celebrating those festivities, except that the event was partly changed into two events. And even if only the second event that had taken precedence, and that was celebrated on the second day after the former old year's end, brought the same meaning of something that finishes or dies, little by little, the celebration of All Saints, All Hallows' Eve, or All Saints' Eve. A ne'er-do-well, a useless person, a drunkard, a skinflint, an object of pity, a thief, an assassin, in fact, this was what people thought of Jack. However, the time that ended with celebrations, there was no longer the time of the seasons. So all that was left to celebrate was the time of men, of life, of their life, and of that of their dear departed. And they supposed that the dead might return to visit the world of the living not only on the night before the festival, but that even on the night before, the living could perceive something of the world beyond, or at least the beginning of the road that led to the gates of paradise, or those of hell. They were unconsciously looking back to the old calendar, and that particular day, between the end of the old year and the beginning of the new, that was placed outside the wheel of time. Jack never celebrated whether the festivities were joyful or not, though to a certain extent he celebrated all the time, because he couldn't allow himself to celebrate. He couldn't even allow himself to live as others wanted him to anymore. Chapter 2. Nothing Right. Now Jack couldn't get anything right. And yet he had 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 2 hands, at least as good as anyone else's. He could even do well at his trade as a blacksmith when he took the trouble. He had 2 legs to carry him off to look for any other decent and profitable way of earning a living and leading a respectable life if being a blacksmith wasn't enough for him. His brain, too, was no worse than any other part of his body, either as a young man or when he started to be not so young anymore. On the contrary, there were times when he even seemed brighter than average. And it wasn't only himself and the gentle, down-to-earth lovers he had who thought so. He'd tried almost everything, with varying results. Even some things that most people wouldn't even dare to try. Now Jack, just to find a new quality in him was, at least, fearless. He had and always had the courage to take risks. There was only one life, and it was to be lived like a wager, but not to gain the prospect of a possible eternity, as someone would theorize one day long afterwards. Someone who was to become almost as well known as Jack, but to live well while alive. And so, as far as he could, he took risks and experimented in other areas of life too, not only in the one that gave him the food to live on. But all too often, he finished up getting lost in human temptations that most people, because of the moral imperative of the times Jack lived in, held to be the work of the devil. And even Jack himself, at times, when he had to hold himself to account, when he had to face up to the disappointment of a defeat or the frustration of too many failures piling up, was moved to think that those people, so virtuous and worthy, were right, that the temptations he gave way to from time to time really were the cause of his misfortunes. So he ended up believing in the existence of the devil. Certainly not because he believed that his temptations really were the work of the devil, or just because those people insisted so much and with such conviction on his existence, but because there had to be an explanation for his bad luck, and, perhaps unconsciously or perhaps not, he thought it wiser to look for it elsewhere, rather than in other people, or within himself, and see how, as could happen to so many others too, even one of Jack's few praiseworthy qualities could be and become one of his defects as well. However it came about. Perhaps because almost all men around him believed in him, not to mention those who lived further away, many, many days' walk from the place where he lived. Or perhaps because he really did exist, even though now, while we still continue to celebrate in our own way the memory of this man, most people find it hard to believe it possible. But for whatever reason, Jack started to believe in the existence of the devil. The devil. A malign angel who was making fun of him, who fixed everything so that good fortune would never come his way, so that his life would never be what he would have liked it to be, so that his earthly body wouldn't bring to fruition the heavenly designs his soul entrusted to it, so as to take over that same soul on the day his body would no longer be there to contain and protect it. Jack put his belief in the devil even before his belief in God, because everyone else feared him and believed in him, and the devil was so real that you could even meet him in the street, while if you were fairly reckless, as Jack was, you could even invite him to go out with you, and why not, perhaps even hope to befriend him. Chapter 3. The Skinflint. Jack, he was a skinflint. At heart, Jack felt he was a generous man. If only he could win with the wagers he often made, or earned enough dough not to have to think about money any more, he would certainly have handed out enough alms to the poor to make them forget about their poverty. Jack was quite sure of that. Jack knew only too well what poverty meant, and misery and desperation. No way had he learnt about them from books. He had lived them, touched them with his hand, with both hands. And not only with his hands, he smiled bitterly to himself, but with his stomach too, and his mouth when he didn't have anything to eat, with his teeth and all over his body when he shuddered from the cold and he knew he'd never forget them. His feet and legs reminded him as well when they weren't tired of walking without ever getting anywhere. Even if he had entered the mansions of heaven with those very same feet, even if he had become the king of heaven and rested those feet and legs on a magnificent throne. But people only saw what they saw, and remembered what they remembered, thought Jack. And he certainly didn't make much effort to show himself off in his better moments, and still less in his best clothes. At those times, and in those clothes, he had plenty of other things to think about. And indeed, there wasn't much he could do about it, or rather, it seemed to him that there wasn't much left for him to do, because time was passing by, without seeming to care about making him wait. And at times, when he was feeling down, he really didn't know what to do any longer. In his more successful moments, he succeeded in getting his courage back and believing in himself again. But each time, he could find nothing better to do than wager everything he had left on a game. And by now, he had practically nothing left. Not even the wherewithal to pay for his own drinks, let alone anyone else's as well. So, by now, everyone thought of Jack as just a skinflint, and even today someone, "To hell with him," as Jack would doubtless have said, even records him with this nickname, Jack the Skinflint, or worse still, Jack the Drunken Skinflint. Jack had only himself left, only himself to count on. From time to time it made Jack smile that he did still have himself to rely on. Chapter 4. The Will of the Wisp. Jack, the Will of the Wisp. The Will of the Wisp, as some people also call him today, and perhaps called him even then, or just Will, as they may have called him then and others still call him today. But it was still him, his body and his soul, his body that was growing old, wearing out, and deteriorating from the passage of time and too many drinks. To hell with them too many drinks. Or the effect that he was seeking from them passed more and more quickly. And his conscience, his soul, that divine spark that at times blurred by his dejection, hidden by his frustration and almost extinguished in his depression, didn't seem to glow any more, but rather seemed to have shrunk to a minimum, like a feeble little wisp. Will o' the Wisp, as someone who never knew him alive will call him after hundreds of years have passed, since the time when he did still carry that precious spark in his body. The Wisp, as perhaps someone did call him then, when his soul was still one with his body, jokingly teasing him to his face, or perhaps making a mockery of him behind his back, like a flash in the pan, like a big lantern that dies down to less than nothing rather than lighten its life, the darkest part of his life. It was reduced almost at once to a tiny flame, a little light that flickered uncertainly in the turmoil of his days, always seeming to be just on the verge of going out. The Wisp, as people perhaps called him even then, to denote the sad, pathetic end of his outbursts, of his attempts to get the better of himself. He who would have liked to become, and perhaps could have become, a shining light, if he had only found a way to feed the quintessential flame that burned tiny and faint in his soul. But what can I do? Jack racked his brains, when his desperation wasn't so great as to make him prefer to forget about everything, himself, his failures, people, and the world, when it wasn't he himself trying to put out that faint little flame by drinking what little he could allow himself to buy. The same Jack, whom others would one day remember instead as Jack O'Lantern, the Lantern Man, the man who was to give his name to the lanterns that glow on a feast day when all men will try to forget death, to forget that life on earth doesn't last forever, by dancing and joking, trying, just as he tried, to forget by drinking and joking, with the time he had left to live, a feast day on which that very Jack will be remembered by most of humanity, perhaps to the end of time, as Jack O'Lantern. Jack the Lantern. Chapter 5. The Gambler. Jack the Gambler. But there were times when Jack felt like a winner, too. Someone who could have won, at least some of the time. In the end, it would have been enough for him to get it right at the right time. The time when it really mattered. In the end, he did win. But only at times when it didn't really matter. However, the memory of those times was enough to encourage him to go back to the game and have another go. By this time Jack was mixing up the game of life with the games to change his life, and with the others that instead are games that are useful for living. But who could have helped him? His friends? Those who paid for the drinks and got drunk alongside him? And when? When could he have ever made a real attempt to change? If the time to forget also took up the time to attempt some redemption, what should Jack do with his life? With the days that he still had left in his human form? What should he have done with them, Jack, with all those days that started halfway through the afternoon, after a night, and half his life spent blind drunk? He needed to deal with his problem, and if the cause of his misfortunes wasn't himself or even others, but the devil himself, why then it was the devil that had to be dealt with. He had to make him understand that he must leave him in peace, that he had to stop leading him into temptation, and that if he as a demon was shrewd and malicious, then he himself as a man, with the help of God, was even more so. So he tried to use what little he had left, even his own weaknesses and his own deficiencies, what he hadn't been or had up to now, to try to redeem himself. One more time, just one, then never again. Yes, because then, if he won, he would change, he said to himself, to convince himself and deceive himself. He would change his life for as much or as little time as he had left to live. Jack, the winner. Chapter 6. Only a Dreamer. Deep, deep down, Jack was only a dreamer. First and foremost, however, to succeed in his enterprise of beating the devil by a trick, Jack had to hide his own plans and his own thoughts by bluffing and lying even to himself. Yes, because the devil, being an angel as well, or more to the point actually being the very devil in person, could certainly listen to and hear his thoughts. But as far as deceiving himself went, this came easily to him by now, almost the most natural thing in the world, so much so that anyone who could have free access to his mind would certainly not have noticed anything new or suspicious. When he was young, and his dreams were young too, Jack didn't call his dreams bluff or lies. Not a single one of them. But in time, he had gradually begun, at first with a certain disenchantment, to call them illusions. And even if he wasn't aware of it, they gradually became no more than straightforward lies. But all the same, Jack couldn't deal with them, even when life with its hard knocks made him realize it. He still couldn't stop feeling the need for them anyway. He really couldn't do without those lies, because those lies were all that he had left of his dreams, just as he could not do without eating, at least every so often. And he could only forget them, just as he could more easily skip meals, when he was drunk. And so, once more, with a smile of anticipation in his eyes, he dressed up again in his best dreams. But this time he freely allowed the devil to visit him with his temptations from the very beginning for as many times as he liked. It was he himself who invited him in, making him think he was ready for anything, that he was available for any temptation whatsoever, egging him on, provoking him, and making him think that from now on he was more than ready to give up his soul to him without any reservation. And more often the devil started to visit his home, himself, his body, wherever he might be, and his thoughts, especially because, unfortunately for Jack, his end was approaching, although he didn't know it yet, until one evening, the very evening when he should have been celebrating the festival of All Saints, and people in fear and grief were already thinking of the dead and of the great veil which, set up to separate the world of the living from that of the dead, was about to wear thin enough to allow the spirits of the dead to cross it without any difficulty. Just then, Jack put his life on the line, torn between his desire for the festival and the memory of ever-present death, ready for the final reckoning, torn between the dreams of a lifetime and the reality of his lies. Jack, resplendent as the sun and irreverent as the moon, invited the devil himself to go out and have a drink with him. Chapter 7. The Devil. Jack knew the devil would accept because he knew the devil couldn't help being tempted to take possession of his soul, whether it was for one night or for all eternity. Jack and the Devil. Jack, who asked the devil to go out and have a drink with him. Jack, with his heart in his mouth and his mind in chaos. The devil and Jack. The devil, who accepted Jack's proposition. The devil, self-assured and radiant as the fire that was shining in his eyes. Jack and the devil, side by side, going for a walk and smiling with joy, excitement, and the expectation of what might happen. Because anything could happen at any time. Because everything was still to play for. Even for someone like Jack. Even for someone like the devil. Jack had nothing with him except for the little empty purse that he clutched tightly to his chest. The little purse which held the silver cross that he had once forged with the fire of his smithy from the last coin he had. As he prayed to God to consecrate it and to help him change his ways. But then he'd pretty much driven it from his mind somehow. One day when his dreams got mixed up with the mists of the world. Only his hands seemed to remember it, although he hadn't asked them to. They held that little purse close to him, as if it was his own soul. They held it tight for his own sake. The devil, on the other hand, seemed to have everything. He was young and handsome, attractive and intelligent, ironic and suave, rich and pleasant, self-assured and captivating. He seemed to have everything except Jack's soul. But he was now sure he could have that, just as in the eyes of the world he had already taken a large part of his life, and this made him even more joyful and magnanimous to his human companion that evening. Jack should have offered, and wanted to offer him a drink. The devil had to tell him, and wanted to tell him that in reality it would be his last drink, because that very evening would have also been the moment of his death. Jack thought he could trick the devil, making him pay for the drink and forcing him to leave him in peace in one fell swoop, proposing just one wager to him that he was sure to win. The devil, as was his custom, usually allowed one last bodily wish to men who were about to die and surrender their soul to him, a gesture of gratitude, as it were, for the soul that he would take immediately afterwards, a way of exchanging a sort of advance tip, seeing that he would certainly never be able to give one afterwards, to that shell that he was going to empty out, and would soon be dispersed between the territories of earth, the mists of heaven, and the dusts of time. Meanwhile they had barely reached the doors of the bar to which Jack had led the devil. Meanwhile the bar they had reached was the exact same bar that the devil had induced Jack to lead him to. Jack, a little confused, because he was filled with anxiety about muddling up the words that the devil had put into his mind that was deceiving itself, and those that Jack himself wanted to use to trick the devil, said, "I'll bet you a bottle of beer," which he wouldn't be allowed to pay for anyway, "that you won't be able to turn yourself into a coin. A coin! A coin for me to pay for your drink with." Now Jack had told himself that if the devil did not accept, he would lose the bet. But even if he did accept, he could still lose it, because before paying for their drinks, that coin would be in Jack's hands, and he could do whatever he liked with it, if only he could not buy the drink straight away for himself and the devil, who shortly after the payment would return to his human form again. So he would not only have won the bet anyway, but would also have overcome himself. Now Jack was certain that at that point the devil would stop tempting him. Now the devil knew what Jack was saying in his head, because it was he himself who ensured that Jack said it, and it didn't matter if the terms of the bet were a bit confused or didn't make much sense. He wanted to turn into a coin not only so as to tempt Jack to get drunk again, but also because he wanted to grant his last wish in this way. And he was sure of it, because it was he himself who had led Jack to lie to himself before playing with his dreams and doing everything to turn them into naive and false illusions, and then gradually making a mockery even of those very same thoughts. The devil was sure that with this coin, Jack would not be capable of doing anything other than buying him something to drink, buying it in that way, something to drink, for himself too. The devil looked into Jack's soul and told him that he was ready to do what he wanted because he was going to die, and that he would agree to turn himself into a coin to buy something to drink, not only for the sake of the wager, but also to make him happy if this was his last wish. Jack looked the devil in the eye and felt himself die, even though he wasn't really dying yet. The devil winked and smiled at him. Eye to eye, Jack and the devil, a man and his destiny. After a while, after Jack's life had already started to pass before his eyes, the devil, knowing the answer already, asked, "Is that what you would like for your last wish?" After a while, Jack had his answer ready. Eye to eye, he managed to hold his gaze. The devil and Jack, a man and his choices. The devil gave a half smile, raising an eyebrow. Jack heard himself say, "Yes, that's what I want." Jack had gone back to making bets again. Jack was only a drunkard, a drunken skinflint. Jack was showing himself once more to be just a tight-fisted miser who had succeeded in making even the devil pay for his drinks. Chapter 8. The Little Purse and the Cross. Jack clutched an empty purse tight between his hands, as if it was his very soul. The clink of a coin bouncing before him on the stones of the street startled him, and he tried to find out where it was falling. Then his eyes caught sight of it, and it rolled towards his feet. The devil who had been drinking with him dressed as a fine young man was nowhere to be seen. There was only himself, alone in the world, only himself and his hands reaching down to pick up a coin. He was alone, and in those hands was his destiny. But did Jack know that his destiny was in his hands? There had been a time when a young Jack had believed it, another time in which Jack, now a fully grown man, began to have his doubts, and yet another in which Jack, who had started to grow old, had stopped believing it. And if he hadn't actually stopped believing it in his dreams, nevertheless, those dreams seemed to him now to be tainted with lies and deceptions. Jack was still hoping, but he no longer knew for sure. "Jack! Hey, Jack, are you paying for the drinks this time?" shouted some of his drinking companions, who came flocking around him as soon as they noticed his hands picking up a coin from the floor. Meanwhile, Jack's hands had instinctively put that coin into his empty little purse and closed it again, locking that unique coin in with the silver cross. At once, in his head, he heard the devil cry out, "Damn you, Jack! What have you done? Jack, take me out at once, Jack!" But his friends dragged him into the bar. This time that tight-fisted fellow Jack couldn't say he hadn't any money. Not this time. It was his turn to buy the drinks. The devil kept on screaming in his head, "Jack, let me out, Jack! Let me out and I'll give you anything you want, but please get me out of here now! Jack!" Meanwhile, his friends were ordering the drinks. "Come on, Jack, are you plotting a way to get out of it?" they said to him, slapping him on the back. The situation in some ways was better than he could have hoped for. Just now the devil had smilingly told him that his life was about to end, and now he was beseeching him to let him go. "Jack, let me out, Jack!" he went on, as if he were in the grip of desperation, the devil. "You rotten miser! Why are you waiting to order the drinks? This time it's your turn to pay." His friends went on, putting their arms around his shoulders, shaking him a little as good pals do. As usual, the whole world was milling round him, and as always he had the feeling that it was ganging up on him. "Jack!" The devil's cries were piercing screams inside his head. "But where have you hidden your fine coin, eh?" his friends went on, losing patience. What was really going on was that Jack had the devil in his power. He could ask for lovers and riches, honors and palaces. "Tell me what you want, Jack," the devil pleaded insistently. "Get it out, then," his friends sneered, mocking him, their hands in his pockets and under his jacket, tickling him, teasing him. And his friends carried on yanking and provoking him in all sorts of ways, some of them holding on to him, and others pretending to frisk him, while others were putting their hands all over him, even where they knew they wouldn't find the purse or the money, just for the pleasure of enjoying themselves, laughing at him and making fun of him. Jack would have loved to get out of that awful place. Jack only wanted them to leave him in peace. He wanted to live in peace, relaxed and quiet. Jack just wanted the devil not to tempt him any more. Jack wanted the devil to let him live longer. "Maybe you hid it here," one of his drinking companions challenged him, more drunk than the rest, groping him between the legs. Jack backed away hastily, but that only gave an opportunity to someone else, who with a mocking whistle took advantage of it by putting a hand between his buttocks, then added amidst general derision, "Maybe it's stuck in here." Instinctively, Jack retreated again, taking a few steps forward. In fact, he was being tossed between them like a pinball. The devil was screaming more and more inside his head. "Jack, let me out!" "Hey, now then, stop pissing me off, you rotten bastards!" shouted Jack. He struggled free and tried to throw some punches at his companions in misfortune, who were always half drunk even before it was evening. He was really fed up with them, at least as much as he was fed up with himself. Jack, to set the devil free again, in the end, just asked him for his life. And he was so confused he didn't even know any more how much time he'd been granted. There are some who say that he only asked for 1 more year, and others who instead say he asked for 10. 10 years to succeed in doing what he had not been able to do up until then, and to prove to himself that he was a man. Jack took out the little purse that his hands had been clutching to his breast. From the little purse he took out the coin those same hands had picked up from the ground not long before. He saw his hands place it on the counter without even hearing what his old companions were shouting in chorus, and almost ran out of the bar. His friends continued to shout in celebration or in victory, but the real victory was the one Jack felt in his heart. At last he was outside the bar, breathing the fresh air. He felt free. He felt as if he had been given another chance. He inhaled great gulps of air, because now he could truly start to live and breathe again. Meanwhile, the coin that he had left on the counter ended up in the hands of the landlord, and immediately afterwards amongst his other coins, and then it suddenly disappeared, without the host even noticing, until he came to do his account late that evening. Meanwhile, a young man joined Jack's companions to have a drink, and actually drank from Jack's glass. Immediately afterwards he left too, but only to take a different road from Jack's. The devil always kept his promises, even when he had been tricked. Jack had tricked the devil. Chapter 9, 10 Years On. Jack lived for another 10 years. And in all those years the devil let him live in peace. Did Jack really stop drinking and gambling? He really did stop drinking and gambling, as some like to tell. Jack even stopped thinking about the devil. His fate was in his own hands again, and this time he would no longer let anyone make anything of it other than what he would like to make of it himself. But to other people, Jack was still a man who couldn't get anything right. That's how many people liked to remember him. People didn't change, and they only saw what they wanted to see and remembered what they wanted to remember, Jack would have said. Except perhaps for someone, for those few people to whom Jack mattered, and who mattered a bit to Jack. And among all of them, among the overwhelming majority of the people who did not matter at all to him, he even managed to glimpse the face of a new love. Even time had not changed. For those who wanted it to hurry by, he continued to drag, and it passed quickly for those who wanted it to pass slowly. So for those 10 years passed, really much too quickly, thought Jack. They finished as fast as a mug of beer once it's been started. Actually, they came to an end even more quickly than the pints that Jack used to swallow in earlier times when he wanted them to pass more quickly, while instead, at that time, they seemed to drag on forever, because sadly they were always the same. And that year, too, autumn had already started to adorn the plains and the sea, the sides of the rivers and the foot of the mountains with haze and stillness. And it was just when All Saints' Eve had come round again, in the days before anyone called it Halloween, when the devil came back to visit Jack again. The very devil himself in person, the very same one who Jack had dared to invite to go out for a drink with him. The devil certainly had not forgotten that evening, nor the number of years he had granted to Jack. Jack, who held the devil in his fist and could have asked him for anything he wanted. Chapter 10, The Apple Tree. Jack and the devil meet again, because the devil had come back once more to claim his soul. This time, however, the devil did not find Jack at home drunk, or ready to go out with him to have a drink in a bar. Jack was out in the fields, and the devil had to catch up with him there. The devil was still young and handsome as ever, as he had been the last time they met. To Jack's eyes he still appeared attractive and intelligent, ironic and suave, rich and pleasant, self-assured and captivating, not to mention that half-smile of his, mocking and tempting. Jack wasn't as young as he had been 10 years earlier, but he didn't seem much older either. Perhaps because he had stopped trying to wreck his body and his dreams. From that time onwards, he no longer ended up accusing them of being nothing but lies, just as the little purse he still carried with him was no longer empty. And his brain was still working properly, as he knew at once that the devil had not come to invite him out for a drink, or to tempt him in any other way. He had come to take his soul, because the extra years of life he had promised and granted him had gone by. Jack looked deep into his very soul before looking him in the eye, and he smiled. The devil returned that look and that smile in advance, even before Jack had stopped looking into his very soul, even though this time he wasn't able to read Jack's thoughts easily. But he thought that by now there wouldn't be many of them left, and, indulgent as ever, he asked Jack if he had one last request to make of him that he would like to be granted. Jack looked round, but without the desperation of the previous time, and with no drinking companions to torment him, and he saw an apple tree not far away with mist swirling about it, still laden with fruit that perhaps would never fully ripen. Those slightly sour apples, able to keep the warm scent of hay inside and the cold flavor of cider. So he asked the devil to climb the tree to pick an apple for him, one of the finest that grew high, high up, right at the top. An apple. Really, an apple? The devil smiles to himself, almost dumbfounded with surprise at this strange request. He would never have dreamed that one day there might actually be a man who would ask him for an apple. For a moment, the devil looked at him suspiciously, then decided to grant his request. He had no fear of Jack playing any nasty jokes on him this time. All he had to do was climb up a tree and pick an apple. Jack helped the devil to get up. He cupped his hands to make a foothold for the devil's foot, and first he grabbed his shoulders and then some forks of the tree. Jack was aware of the presence of the devil as he had never felt it before. The curls that hid his little goat's horns brushed against his face. He felt the contact of the devil's hands on his shoulders like the red, hot touch of a supernatural force, and a shiver ran through him. The devil quickly climbed to the highest branches of the tree, and even more quickly, although rather shakily, Jack took out a carving knife with a blade that was always kept sharpened, and carved a cross on the trunk of the tree. He prayed to Jesus to consecrate it there and then, and the devil immediately felt the effects of the cross and Jack's desperate prayers to Jesus Christ even before Jack could say anything, and once more felt he had been stopped, this time imprisoned up a tree which he wouldn't be able to get down from in a hurry, not even by jumping or changing his shape. But this time the devil didn't just howl in agony, but he howled even more from rage, and he began to argue with Jack at the top of his voice, with the Jack who was more sure of himself and strengthened by previous experience, a Jack once more determined to negotiate for his very life, in an attempt to get from the devil some conditions for giving up his claim to his soul that were better than the last time, in exchange for removing the cross he had carved. The devil got as far as offering him another 10 years, or perhaps more. But Jack did not give way, and succeeded in asking him to give up all claims to his soul forever. The devil just wanted to be set free as quickly as possible because, apart from the torment and the anguish that he suffered from the cross that kept him imprisoned in the tree, he also had lots of other souls to tempt and to take to hell. And so, in the end, he gave in and made him the promise. Jack had tricked the devil for the second time. Chapter 11. The Blacksmith. Once more Jack had prevented the devil from taking his soul. But Jack had not asked the devil to be able to live forever, and it probably wouldn't have been within the devil's powers to grant this. And even this time he did not ask the devil for material things, neither honors nor riches nor anything else. Yet they still called him stingy, greedy, and a skinflint. It was enough for Jack to be able to live away from temptation. It was enough for him to be able to get on in peace and quiet with the things that he was able to do and enjoyed doing, to get just enough to keep himself alive, trying to meet as much as possible the needs of the community as a blacksmith. Jack just wanted to be a blacksmith. Jack was a blacksmith, a workman. Chapter 12. The Journey. But Jack got on with his life and continued not to get anything right. By now, Jack was a failure in the eyes of everyone. Yes, of course, he was a blacksmith, but a blacksmith like so many others. Perhaps worse than many others. A stingy blacksmith who wouldn't even go out in the evenings to have a drink with his friends. Always shut up at home, surely doing witchcraft with the fire of his forge always lit. This is what they thought of him by now. Even the lover whose face he had picked out among the indifferent crowd had finally stopped looking for him, Still less did she come round any more. Jack had driven her away because he didn't feel he had the stature to return the love that was offered to him. Not yet. He was ashamed of himself, and of the fact that he couldn't promise her a future that held more dignified and comfortable way of living together. To be able to change his life, he first needed to earn and save up quite a bit. Then he would be granted a lover. That's what he told himself. No need to add that people thought he did this too, only out of avarice. Because deep down, he wanted to keep everything to himself and not share anything. No need to say that time continued to go by without waiting for him to become the man he would have liked to be, or that the wealth, some wealth, a tiny bit of wealth, as much wealth as would allow him not to have to think constantly and desperately about that very wealth, really just that much wealth, to arrive. However, little by little, Jack understood that, in reality, his problems and his failures were not, in the last resort, due to the devil tempting him, because the devil was not tempting him any more, nor to the other people who didn't understand or appreciate him, because he didn't lack work, or even people who sought his company. And so, the problem must lie somewhere within himself, or within his destiny. But because in each case he no longer had any idea of what to do to change them, he decided to leave, to go away in the here and now, in order to distance himself from his past. He was hoping he would find a new self and a new destiny somewhere. Or if these couldn't change, well, never mind, as they wouldn't even be changed just the same by remaining where he was. With an effort, Jack resigned himself to accepting the fact that his real problem had not been the devil tempting him, and he went away to find himself. Chapter 13. The Wanderer. Jack went away to travel the world in search of his path, his life's journey. Jack put his affairs in order, finished the work he had started on, went along one more time to buy some rounds for his old drinking companions, as he'd been in the habit of doing from time to time, to remind himself of his own misery. He seemed to notice it more easily when he saw it reflected in others. And one day, just like any other, as if he was just going for a walk that was a bit longer than usual, he went away, without saying goodbye to anyone, without anyone saying goodbye to him, almost without anyone realizing. He traveled on foot, as all poor people traveled in those days, to nowhere in particular, stopping to do some work or other every so often to pay for his food, and for somewhere to sleep as well when it was too cold to stop and rest without a man-made building around him. Little by little, as he went further afield, the countryside slowly changed, just as the appearance of the people slowly changed. Their manner of dressing, eating, even speaking, although deep down, people were still the same apart from their appearance. This is the conclusion Jack nearly always reached. Until one day he arrived in a place where even the religion and morality seemed to have changed. He realized this almost out of the blue, when he saw a strange statue of someone he had known well, even though some of the characteristics were very different. He stopped to study the face, the features that were delicate and manly at the same time, both angelic and bestial, with that slight wisp of a beard surrounding his lips and going down to his chin, like a simple goatee except that it continued round the sides, barely covering the most bulging parts of the jaw to highlight only the angular lines before joining with the thin sideburns, and from thence mingling with the long curly locks that fell down onto his shoulders. It really seemed to be the statue of the devil, in the form of the young man he had known, who had tempted him so many times, whom he had gone out with, and whom he had managed to get the better of twice. But it didn't have the two little goat's horns barely standing out on his head that you could hardly see between the curly locks of hair, that reminded him clearly of that light and bruising contact. It had two enormous horns, practically the antlers of some great stag, and aristocratic torques hung everywhere, even on the branches of the great horns, and even had a bag full of money plainly showing. Jack lowered his gaze to the feet of the statue that was crouching down and seemed intent on studying, with that half-smile that he remembered so well, a marvelous future coming towards him, ready to catch it in flight as the hunter does with his prey. And he read the word, Cernunnos, Cernunnos, Cernunnos. Jack smiled to himself. In fact, it seemed to him to be scarcely probable for him to arrive in his wanderings beyond the confines of the world as he knew it, to arrive among truly different people who openly worshipped the devil instead of the Lord, and not because he thought he knew the devil well, but because he thought he knew people well. Jack the Wanderer. Chapter 14. Destiny. Jack and Destiny. All of a sudden, Jack remembered ancient stories of his people, now handed down as memories of memories. Memories of times when days didn't start halfway through the night, but immediately after sunset, and he thought he understood why people on feast days started to celebrate them from the night before, on the eve of the festivities, and finished celebrating just as the evening of the actual feast day arrived, because the evening was exactly the time at which the days once used to begin, as if people still knew, but didn't remember any more, because by then the way in which the hours, days, and years were calculated had been changed too long ago. He even remembered that each year in the old calendar there was a timeless day, a day outside time, that did not belong to the old year that was already over, or the new year that was still to come. A thin veil divides the world of the living, the world of days, that is made up of the days of their life, from the world of the dead, the one of pure eternity, where days are not days. On that day it wore so thin that amidst the autumn mists it was possible to look into the other world, and whoever knew what to do, and had the courage to do it, could even go there. And suddenly, on the wave of that flash of unexpected knowledge, more or less established and right, Jack even seemed to have better insight into himself, his life, his past. Everything became clear and transparent, without regrets, without remorse, without mistakes. Even the worst events of his life and the strange coincidences seemed clear and inevitable steps of the dance of destiny. And he smiled as he remembered that both the times when he had tricked the devil had actually happened on that very day. He raised his eyes to look at the half-smile of the statue of Cernunnos, as the statue of Cernunnos continued to stare into the future. As it crouched there, he stroked one of its hairy legs that happened to be at the same height as his arm, and although he went on smiling, his eyes misted over a bit. He was roused by the shouts of men and women he heard coming towards him, voices mixed with the sounds of laughter, a hasty step that seemed anxious yet joyful. "Get a move on! What are you doing staring at that statue? Join in the festivities! This is the night when you'll see spirits while you're still alive," said one of the young men in a strong and vigorous voice as he came right up to Jack and addressed him in person. "All the fires in the houses and taverns will be out by now. What are you waiting for?" added one of the red-cheeked girls in festive clothes with a mask hung round her neck. "Come on, come with us. You don't want to lose your mind tonight, do you?" Her voice was sweet and beguiling, and that boy and that girl actually moved away from the group even before it got up to Jack, as they walked along with a determined step, linking arms with him gently but firmly on either side, so there would be no need for them to say it again. Jack, still smiling, finally let life overcome him without even saying, "All right, let's go." All Jack could think was that that night really was about to be the start of one of those timeless days. Chapter 15. The World. Jack and the World. Jack turned back with difficulty as he did his best to keep up with the pace of his new companions, and caught sight of the statue resting on its low pedestal, just above the heads of the lively group that was growing larger and larger as it gained recruits along the way. He tried to meet those eyes that were looking into the future, and perhaps it was not by chance that he succeeded. It took less time than the blink of an eyelid, and yet he felt himself pierced through by a breath of wind, too light to make a single leaf stir, yet strong enough to revive the feeble flame of his spirit with strength and an unexpected vigor, so that at last it began to burn with a life of its own, and he was certain that those eyes that were staring fixedly at a marvelous future at that precise moment already knew for a while that they would have looked just at him. And that feast of the final harvest was the finest feast day that Jack had ever celebrated, or perhaps just the first one, and not only because of the people's joy that seemed to be matched with the joy of the bonfire, not only because of the gaiety and abundance of the food and drink whose leftovers were thrown into the fire, as a sign that everything was coming to an end and being thrown into the past, but because of the joy he experienced in his heart to feel at one with the others, with the past and the future, and it did not much matter to him if the thin veil that divided the worlds that evening would wear so thin that it almost dissolved. It did not much matter if all the spirits of the nether world were about to come back to this world with nostalgia and regrets, or perhaps to dispense wisdom and forgiveness, and one should take them very seriously. Jack had found his place in the world, and he would not spend the long night of the year, namely the long winter, on his own. That celebration finally symbolized for Jack an event of the destruction and the reconstruction of the time of his life, as it had to symbolize the destruction and reconstruction of the time in the universe. His participation in that celebration guaranteed that he would not be left out in future, because the whole community would not leave him out. And so, at the end of the festival, when all the families were taking flames straight from the sacred bonfires to carry them back to their houses and relight their home fires again, Jack, still accompanied by his new friends, who were about to become his family as well, took a burning firebrand from the ashes and put it inside a huge turnip that he had just carved with his knife, so he could carry it easily. And he tied the turnip to the top of a stick, thinking he could use it as a lantern, thus trying in his own way to contribute to the common good in exchange for the hospitality he received. That evening, Jack's new family was the first to use a lantern to light their own way home, towards the new year that had hardly started, and towards their own future. But it wasn't long before many others copied them, almost as soon as they saw it, and Jack became for everyone, from that moment onwards, and for all his new future that had hardly begun, the man with the lantern, Jack O'Lantern. Jack and his first real celebration, for Jack that really was his first real celebration. Chapter 16. Journeying. Jack on a journey again, always on a journey, journeying forever. Perhaps Jack did indeed find his place in the world and the best road to travel for the steps that he still had to fulfill along his path in this world, or so we like to think and tell. And many more years were to pass before he arrived on another of the days outside the cycle of time in which, as well as the end of the year, his life was to end too. But that time the devil did not appear any more to reclaim his soul, nor did any angel of paradise come to accompany him to where he wanted to go. Jack found himself alone once more, immensely alone, because now he had learned not to be alone any more. He had learned to be part of something else, perhaps of everything. And unexpectedly, he found himself on his own again, without knowing what to do or where to go. But he did not lose heart. It was the very night in which it was easier to pass from one world to another, and Jack had already confronted the devil twice. He certainly was not afraid of setting off on his own once more, and perhaps he would even reach the gates of paradise. He had already set off when in the distance he noticed that the family he had left behind had lit lots of lanterns made from turnips, as if to show him the way and send him a last farewell. Then he saw they were joined by other lanterns, all those from his own people, and then still more as far as his eye could see. The night was no longer black. Everyone remembered him, and they would remember him forever. He was no longer alone in his soul. But perhaps the mists were to blame, with which autumn had already started to adorn the world. Or perhaps it was because the road to paradise really was closed to him on account of the misdeeds that he had never repented of. Or perhaps only because that was what his destiny wanted. The fact is that Jack found himself in front of the gates of hell. The fact is, the devil found himself in front of Jack's soul, practically naked, facing him. And the devil was half naked too, when Jack saw him. His body now seemed to be really on fire from within, and he appeared as Jack had never seen him before. And Jack's soul too, the devil was already seeing it in flames, even if it was just the reflection of the blazing fire of hell through the huge wide-open doors. Jack paused to look at the devil. He seemed slightly older than he remembered him. He still had the look of a man in the prime of life, only his beard had grown bushy below his chin, twisted into two big curls that still revealed the dimple between them. While before these had seemed like little sideburns on each side of his jaw, they now completely covered his cheeks. But above all, his horns had grown. They weren't yet like the ones on the statue of Cernunnos, but neither were they any longer the little goat's horns that hardly showed through the curls of his long hair. And not only because the hair was very short there on the sides of his head where the horns grew, apart from some untidy rebellious tufts on the top. Now the horns seemed to be at the least a span long. The devil paused to look at Jack, at the light veil of his outward appearance that seemed to cover his soul with a semblance of humanity. And without any need to put this aside, he closely examined what was underneath. Jack's soul seemed rejuvenated. Even in the light of the flames of hell, the darkness and the mists surrounding him, he was able to see the hints and flicker of its vibrations. It was a living soul, vibrant, pulsating, that had somehow found its own frequency, the right frequency for vibrating with the very light of the universe with its own wavelength. And he saw how beautiful it was. He saw it in all its splendor and imagined he could possess it, to experience it, to include it, to merge that light with his own in the vibrant cauldron of hell. Now that soul seemed to the devil to be exactly of the kind that he most wanted. Jack thought that the devil could take on any appearance he wished, even more so here in his own home. The devil understood that Jack's soul might be the best that he could find, perhaps in the whole universe. Jack was not afraid of what seemed just another man to him, even though he knew it was the devil. The devil almost fell in love with that soul, even though he knew it would never be his. Jack, confident and self-assured, smiled at the half-smile of the devil. The devil winked and returned Jack's smile, flashing a half-smile, his own half-smile, with pleased surprise and complicity. Now some say that so as to be able to cease from wandering like a soul in torment, Jack would have had to ask the devil to let him into hell. Others, on the other hand, maintain that he would never have done that, not only because he would prefer to turn back and become a wanderer again, as he had already been for a large part of his life, and it mattered little to him whether it was in this world or some other, but also because he did not want to, having twice tricked the devil precisely so as to not go into hell. But they all agree in stating that in any case, the devil would no longer have wanted to let him in, if only to live up to his word, in spite of being very tempted to take possession of that soul, precisely so as to live up to the promise he had made, even if he had only made it to a man, because the most important thing of all was that he had made it to himself, and in making it to himself he had made it to heaven. It did not matter that he was placed in the depths of heaven, on the other side of that heaven to which people turn their eyes. He was part of it too. He himself was heaven too. That's right. There are some who tell us that the devil really thought in this way. And by now, it might almost be said, while you could not call it friendship, nevertheless, there existed a certain understanding between Jack and the devil. However it came about, before turning back again, Jack made the devil give him a burning firebrand to light his way through the mists and darkness of the night. However it came about, before he went away, the devil gave Jack a burning firebrand to light his way through the mists and darkness of the night. Inasmuch as the firebrand came from hell, there was no risk of it going out, because it was eternal, and Jack already knew how to carry it about with him, making it the core of a handy lantern. For a long time now everyone has known him as Jack-o'-lantern. After all this, he continued on his journey to paradise, or at least to a better place to stay. From that time onwards, Jack still roams about with his lantern in search of the road to paradise, so people say, and this is why he can still be seen as he wanders on Halloween night. Chapter 17, Halloween. Jack and Halloween night. And from that time onwards, every year on Halloween night, people still see Jack wandering with his lantern between the two worlds. Even after the calendar changed also for those who preferred to worship out in the open, many kept on catching sight of him, remembering him, still celebrating that feast day as if it were a day outside the cycle of time. And in his honor, they kept on carving the big yellow turnips that were later replaced by pumpkins and placed lights or candles inside them. So those makeshift lanterns were named after him, Jack-o'-lantern. On the other hand, however, it could be that Jack may no longer be roaming the world with his lantern, between the mists and the silence of autumn, between heaven and earth, between hell and paradise, between eternity and the seasons, and it may no longer be possible to spot him on Halloween night, even if people still telling it so. But people don't change, as Jack would say. They continue to see just what they like to see, and remember just what they like to remember. Perhaps, in the end, Jack did arrive at the gates of paradise, and has now found a way in, or perhaps he has simply finished purging his sins by now, and he could even now be thinking up a way of having a bet with God over the eternity of time. And if he is placing this bet already, this very night, on this very night outside time in which the whole past is destroyed, and the whole future that is yet to come is being created once more, well, good luck, Jack, and good luck to all of us. Jack. This has been Jack's Wagers, written by Wert and Arvel, narrated by Shandon Loring. Copyright Wert and Arvel, production copyright 2014 by Wert and Arvel. Every story is a dream, every dream a story. Special thanks for this book go to all those who bring stories to life and make dreams become real. To all the storytellers of the world, of times past and future. To all the storytellers of our present. And to you who are listening, because you too are a storyteller, the storyteller of your dreams and of your life. Thank you. Dear reader, listener, thank you for reading, listening to this book. I hope you have not found it boring, but have spent some pleasant moments in my company, in that of your thoughts and mine, and of yourself in some timeless place, among the feelings, emotions, and reflections that this story may have inspired. If you like, you can leave a review directly on my website. Apart from being much appreciated, it will be an incentive for new publications. Or you could even send an email directly to wirtonarvel@kintoran.com. WIRTONARVEL at KENTAURON.com to point out potential problems you have met with, typographical errors, or anything else you might like to tell me. Good future. Thank you for listening to StoryLink Radio. If you like what you've just heard, we hope you will subscribe to our podcast and pass along our web address, www.storylinkradio.com. Be sure to visit our website for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Join us next time for another story from StoryLink Radio.